Thomas Blackwood hadn't spoken to another soul in nearly 3 weeks. That wasn't unusual for him. The sprawling cattle ranch he'd inherited from his father stretched across 800 acres of Montana grassland, bordered by distant mountains that turned purple at sunset. Most days, his only companions were the steady rhythm of his own breathing, the occasional lowing of cattle, and the persistent Montana wind that swept across the plains like an invisible tide. At 52, Thomas had grown accustomed to solitude. His wife, Eleanor, had left 15 years ago, claiming the isolation was slowly killing her spirit. Their daughter, Sarah, now lived in Seattle, calling dutifully on the first Sunday of each month. The conversations were pleasant but stilted, filled with careful silences and unasked questions. That October morning began like any other. Thomas rose before dawn, the ranch house creaking around him as he moved through his routine. Coffee brewed strong enough to stand a spoon in, a breakfast of eggs from his small chicken coop, and thick-cut bacon from his last trip into town. The radio murmured quietly about an approaching storm system, predictions of early snow, and political tensions in Washington that felt as distant as the moon. Another day in paradise, he muttered to his reflection in the bathroom mirror, the lines around his eyes deepening as he squinted at himself. His once dark hair had silvered at the temples, and his skin had weathered from years under the Montana sun. Outside, the morning air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter. Thomas pulled his worn sheepskin jacket tighter around his broad shoulders as he made his way to the barn. The cattle needed moving to the southern pasture before the weather turned. It would be a long day's work, but work had been Thomas's salvation for as long as he could remember. By midday, sweat dampened his flannel shirt despite the cool temperature. He dismounted from his chestnut quarter horse, Rusty, to adjust a section of fence that had come loose during the last windstorm. As he worked, something on the horizon caught his attention, a smudge of movement against the distant tree line. Thomas squinted, reaching for the binoculars he kept in his saddlebag. Through the lenses, the smudge resolved into figures, riders on horseback, moving slowly but deliberately across his land. Not just a few riders, but dozens. As he watched, more emerged from the tree line. What in God's name? Thomas muttered, a knot forming in his stomach. He counted quickly. 20, 50. Over 100 riders, their numbers growing as he watched. This wasn't a casual trespass or a group that had lost their way. This was something else entirely. Thomas swung back onto Rusty, heart pounding as he urged the horse toward the ranch house. His rifle was there, and the landline phone, though cell service had finally reached even this remote part of Montana last year. His mind raced through possibilities. Was this some kind of protest? A land dispute he hadn't been informed about? The neighboring Campbell property had been sold to a development company last spring, but Thomas had declined their offers to buy him out. As he crested the hill that overlooked his ranch house, Thomas pulled Rusty to an abrupt halt. The riders had somehow circled around. They were already there, hundreds of them, surrounding his property in a perfect circle. Men and women on horseback, silent and still as statues, their faces impassive as they watched his approach. Thomas's throat went dry. There had to be 500 riders at least, their horses standing shoulder to shoulder in an unbroken ring around his home. No signs, no shouting, no demands, just silent observation. A few wore traditional Native American clothing, others cowboy hats and denim, some dressed in what looked like ceremonial attire from cultures Thomas couldn't identify. He urged Rusty forward, the horse nervous beneath him, sensing his tension. As Thomas approached, the circle of riders parted silently, creating a path to his home. None spoke or made eye contact, their gazes fixed somewhere in the middle distance. At the edge of his property, an older man with weathered skin and silver hair pulled back and a braid nodded almost imperceptibly as Thomas passed. There was something in the man's eyes, not hostility, but a solemn purpose that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. The riders remained motionless as Thomas dismounted and led Rusty to the hitching post by his front porch. His rifle was just inside the door, but something told him these people hadn't come for violence. Still, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across his land, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Whatever these people wanted, However they had organized this silent occupation of his land, Thomas knew one thing with absolute certainty. By nightfall, the solitude he had both cursed and embraced for decades would be irrevocably shattered. Night fell across the ranch with unusual speed, as if the sky itself was hurrying the sun away to make room for whatever was about to unfold. Thomas stood on his porch, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, watching the silent riders. They had not moved for hours, maintaining their circle around his property with inhuman patience. He had tried approaching several of them, questions tumbling from his lips. "Who are you people? What do you want? This is private property." Each attempt was met with the same response, silence and that same distant gaze, as if they were looking through him rather than at him. A call to the county sheriff had yielded little help. "We've got reports of similar gatherings all across the county, Thomas," Sheriff Miller had said, his voice crackling over the landline. "No laws being broken that we can tell. No threats, no trespassing on actual structures, just watching. We're stretched thin, but I'll send a deputy out when I can." That had been 3 hours ago. No deputy had arrived. As darkness deepened, Thomas retreated inside, checking that his rifle was loaded before settling into the worn armchair by the window. From there, he could see the flickering of small fires, now being lit at regular intervals around the circle of riders. Not campfires for cooking or warmth, but small, ceremonial flames that cast just enough light to illuminate the solemn faces of those who tended them. Sleep was impossible. Thomas dozed fitfully in the chair, jerking awake at every creak of the old house, every shift in the wind. Just past midnight, he was startled fully awake by a sound he couldn't immediately identify, a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards beneath his feet. Moving cautiously to the window, Thomas peered out into the darkness. The riders had begun to move, but not toward his house as he had feared. Instead, they were dismounting one by one, each approaching the inner edge of the circle, placing something on the ground, then returning to their horses. Curiosity overcame caution. Thomas grabbed his jacket and flashlight, stepping out onto the porch. The humming grew louder. Hundreds of voices joined in a wordless harmony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't threatening, but it raised the hair on the back of his neck nonetheless. In the beam of his flashlight, Thomas could see what the riders were leaving behind: gifts. Small bundles wrapped in cloth, carved wooden figures, pouches of what looked like herbs or seeds, handcrafted jewelry, small baskets containing fruits or berries, clay pots decorated with intricate designs. The closest item to his porch was a small wooden box with an eagle carved into its lid. Thomas hesitated, then stepped forward to examine it. As his fingers touched the smooth wood, the humming stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Thomas glanced up. Every rider was watching him now, their faces illuminated by the small ceremonial fires. For the first time, he could see them clearly. Men and women of various ages, some appearing to be of Native American descent, others not, but all bearing the same expression of solemn anticipation. The older man with the silver braid that Thomas had noticed earlier broke from the circle, walking slowly toward him. Thomas straightened, heart pounding, the wooden box clutched in his hand. "My name is Joseph Running Bear," the man said, his voice deep and measured, the first words any of the riders had spoken. "We are the guardians of the sacred trust." "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Joseph's weathered face remained impassive. "It is not what we want from you, Thomas Blackwood. It is what the land requires of us all." Before Thomas could respond, Joseph reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something that caught the firelight, a small, aged piece of parchment, folded and refolded countless times until the creases had become part of its texture. "Your grandfather signed this covenant 97 years ago," Joseph said, holding out the parchment. "Today is the day of renewal." Thomas took the document with trembling fingers. His grandfather had died before Thomas was born. He knew the man only through his father's stories of a hard but fair rancher who had survived the Dust Bowl through sheer determination. "I don't understand," Thomas said, unfolding the parchment carefully. The handwriting was faded but legible, his grandfather's signature clear at the bottom beside others in various hands, some in alphabets Thomas didn't recognize. "You will," Joseph replied, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "By dawn, you will understand everything." The parchment trembled in Thomas's hands as he carried it inside, Joseph following at a respectful distance. The other riders remained in their circle, the small fires casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Inside, Thomas switched on the kitchen light, spreading the document carefully on the table that had been in his family for generations, the same table, he realized with a jolt, where his grandfather might have signed this mysterious covenant nearly a century ago. "Read," Joseph said simply, remaining standing while Thomas sank into a chair. The document was written in flowing script, the language formal and sometimes archaic, but its meaning became increasingly clear as Thomas read. In 1927, during a devastating drought that had threatened to destroy not just his grandfather's newly established ranch, but all the surrounding communities, a covenant had been formed between his grandfather and representatives from numerous groups, local Native American tribes, immigrant farming families, and even wealthy landowners from the East. The covenant described an arrangement of mutual aid. His grandfather's land sat atop a crucial watershed that fed streams across the county. In exchange for sharing water rights and allowing certain ceremonial gatherings, the signatories pledged protection and assistance to the Blackwood family in perpetuity. The document specified that every 30 years, the covenant would be renewed through a gathering of descendants from all original signatories. "This is why you're here, for some water rights agreement?" Thomas asked, looking up from the parchment. Joseph's expression remained solemn. "The covenant is far more than a legal document, Mr. Blackwood. It is a sacred trust between your family and the people of this land. Your grandfather understood this. Your father honored it at the last renewal." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "My father never mentioned any of this." "He wouldn't have," Joseph replied. "Part of the covenant is silence. The trust remains strongest when it exists beyond words, in the realm of action and respect." Outside, the humming began again, rising and falling like the wind through prairie grass. "What happens now?" Thomas asked. "You must decide whether to renew the covenant," Joseph said. "The gifts left by the riders are symbols of their continued commitment to this trust. Some are practical, seeds developed to withstand drought, medicinal herbs passed down through generations. Others are spiritual, tokens of protection, symbols of unity." Thomas thought of the hundreds of riders surrounding his home, the quiet determination in their gathered presence. "And if I refuse?" For the first time, Joseph's expression softened slightly. "No Blackwood has ever refused. But the covenant cannot be forced. It must be freely given, as your grandfather gave it." "I need time to think," Thomas said. Joseph nodded. "You have until dawn. I will wait outside." Alone in the kitchen, Thomas reread the document, then paced the length of his home, looking out windows at the silent gathering. The riders remained, patient and unwavering. In his study, Thomas found himself pulling out old family albums, searching for some hint that his father or grandfather had known this day would come. In a box of his father's papers, Thomas found a sealed envelope with his name written in his father's steady hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing only a few lines. "Son, when they come, as they will, remember that our strength has never been in standing alone, but in understanding when to join hands with others. The covenant has protected our family through dust and drought, through war and peace. What seems like surrender is actually the truest form of strength. Dad." Thomas sat heavily in his father's old desk chair, the letter clutched in his hand. Dawn was approaching. He could see the first faint lightening of the sky through the eastern window. A decision was required of him, but the solitary life he had built seemed suddenly fragile in the face of this ancient agreement. With the letter still in hand, Thomas stepped onto the porch. Joseph stood waiting, his face impassive in the pre-dawn light. Beyond him, hundreds of riders sat motionless on their horses, their collective silence more powerful than any words could have been. "I need to understand everything this covenant entails," Thomas said, his voice clear in the still morning air. Joseph nodded once. "Then let me show you what your grandfather saw, and what your father came to know." The true meaning of the covenant can only be understood by witnessing what it has preserved. As the first ray of sunlight broke over the distant mountains, Joseph gestured toward the east. "Come, there is something you need to see." The eastern sky blushed pink and gold as Thomas followed Joseph away from the ranch house. The circle of riders parted silently to let them pass, their faces solemn in the growing light. Thomas noticed details he'd missed in the darkness. Many wore small tokens that matched the gifts they'd left: feathers, beaded necklaces, carved wooden pendants. They walked for nearly a mile across Thomas's property, toward a section he rarely visited, a rocky outcropping that marked the boundary between his grazing land and the undeveloped wilderness beyond. Joseph moved with the surety of someone who knew exactly where he was going, despite the uneven terrain. "My people have walked this path for over 1,000 years, Joseph said without turning, long before there were ranches or property lines or covenants written on paper. As they crested a small rise, Thomas saw their destination, a spring emerging from between two massive boulders, creating a clear pool before continuing as a stream down the hillside. In the early morning light, the water caught the sun's rays, sparkling with an almost otherworldly brilliance. "This is the first water," Joseph said, his voice taking on a ceremonial cadence. "From this spring flows life for all who dwell in this valley." Thomas frowned. He knew his property contained several natural springs that fed the local watershed, but he'd never paid particular attention to this one. "It's just a spring. There are dozens like it across the county." Joseph shook his head slowly. "No, Mr. Blackwood, there are not. Test this water against any other, and you will find differences science cannot easily explain. The mineral composition is unique, as is its unusual resistance to contamination." He gestured toward the surrounding landscape. "Notice how the vegetation grows here, even in years of drought. Notice the tracks around the pool. Animals for miles around come to drink from this source." Looking more carefully, Thomas could see what Joseph meant. The area around the spring was unusually verdant, the grass thicker and greener than it should have been in October. Animal tracks, deer, coyote, even what looked like mountain lion, converged on the pool from all directions. "Your grandfather discovered this spring during the drought of 1927, Joseph continued. "While other ranchers were losing their herds and livelihoods, his cattle remained healthy. He could have kept this place secret, used it solely for his own benefit. Instead, he sought out my grandfather, who was then a respected elder of the Blackfoot tribe." Joseph knelt by the water, dipping his fingers in the crystal-clear pool. Together, they formed the covenant, an agreement that this water would be shared, that this sacred place would be protected from development or exploitation. The other signatories were brought in one by one, representatives of all who depended on this watershed. Thomas stared at the spring, memories stirring. His father had always been adamant about certain portions of their land remaining undeveloped. When a mining company had approached them in the 1990s with a lucrative offer, his father had flatly refused without explanation. "Why the secrecy?" Thomas asked. "Why not just explain the importance?" Joseph stood, wiping his hand dry on his jacket. "Your grandfather understood human nature. Declare something a miracle, and people will come to exploit it. Scientists would want samples, corporations would want to bottle it. The government might claim it for research, or the public good. The covenant protects this place through silence and shared responsibility." Thomas knelt and cupped his hands in the water. It felt different, somehow lighter, more vibrant against his skin. He brought it to his lips. The taste was subtle but distinctive, sweet and mineral-rich, with a clarity that seemed to spread through his body as he swallowed. During the Dust Bowl, when farms were failing and children were dying of dust pneumonia, your grandfather allowed people to come here in secret. Joseph said, "The water saved hundreds of lives. During the drought of 1957, your father did the same. And in 1987, when a mining operation upstream contaminated much of the watershed, this spring remained pure. It provided the only safe water for many families." Thomas looked up at Joseph, understanding dawning. "And now it's my turn." Joseph nodded, his expression softening. "Every 30 years, the descendants gather to renew the covenant. We bring gifts to honor the protector of the spring. We remind the current Blackwood of their sacred duty." The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the landscape. In the distance, Thomas could see the riders still surrounding his ranch house, waiting. "What exactly does renewing the covenant entail?" Thomas asked. "It requires your sworn word to continue protecting this land, to never sell or develop it in ways that would threaten the spring, and to provide access to the water in times of need," Joseph replied. "In return, you receive the protection and support of all covenant families." Thomas gazed at the spring, watching as the water bubbled endlessly from the earth. He thought of his isolated existence, of 15 years alone on this land, never understanding what treasure he had been guarding. The walk back to the ranch was made in contemplative silence. As they approached, Thomas saw that the riders had dismounted, forming a wide semicircle facing his porch. The gifts they had left overnight were now arranged in a precise pattern on the ground, a spiral that began at the edge of the gathering and wound inward toward his home. "They're waiting for your decision," Joseph said quietly. Thomas surveyed the assembled crowd, hundreds of people standing solemnly beside their horses. He recognized some faces now. The owner of the feed store in town, who always gave him a fair price. The veterinarian who had come out in a blizzard last winter when one of his best heifers was having a difficult birth. The mechanic who kept his ancient truck running without charging for every hour of labor. Others were strangers to him, having traveled from across the country, perhaps even further, to be present for this renewal. Thomas noticed different styles of dress, heard murmured conversations in various languages as he passed. All these people, connected by a covenant his grandfather had signed nearly a century ago. On the porch waited a small table that hadn't been there before, covered with a woven blanket in vibrant reds and blues. Upon it sat a clay bowl filled with clear water from the spring, Thomas presumed, and the original covenant document, carefully unfolded. "If you choose to renew," Joseph explained, "you will add your signature below your father's and grandfather's. You will then take the water and offer it to the 4 directions, signifying your commitment to share this blessing with all who need it." Thomas looked out at the gathering. "And then what happens?" "Then we leave, as silently as we came," Joseph said. "We return to our lives, carrying the knowledge that the covenant remains unbroken. You will not see such a gathering again in your lifetime. The next renewal will be your daughter's responsibility, 30 years from now." "Sarah," Thomas said, surprised. "She hasn't set foot on this ranch in years. She has a life in Seattle, a career." Joseph's expression remained calm. "Blood carries obligation, Mr. Blackwood, whether she knows it yet or not. Your daughter is part of this covenant too. When the time comes, she will be called as you were called." Thomas thought of Sarah, his headstrong, independent daughter who had fled the isolation of ranch life as soon as she was able. How would she react to hundreds of silent riders surrounding her home, to talk of sacred springs and generations-old promises? As if reading his thoughts, Joseph added, "Each generation questions the covenant in their own way. Your father doubted too, until he witnessed the power of the spring during the drought of 57. The choice must always be free, but it has never been refused." The morning sun had risen fully now, casting the ranch in golden light. The silent watchers waited, patient and unwavering. Thomas realized that in all his years of solitude, he had never truly been alone. These people had been honoring their part of a covenant he hadn't known existed, watching over him from a distance, ensuring his prosperity in subtle ways he had attributed to luck or his own hard work. Thomas approached the table. Beside the covenant lay a pen, not a modern ballpoint, but an old fountain pen that looked strikingly similar to one his father had always carried. "This was my father's," Thomas said, picking it up. Joseph nodded. "It has signed each renewal." Taking a deep breath, Thomas picked up the pen. Its weight felt significant in his hand, connecting him physically to his father and grandfather before him. He looked once more at the gathered witnesses, then bent and signed his name beneath his father's faded signature. As he straightened, a sound rose from the assembly, not the humming from the night before, but a single clear note that seemed to hang in the air. Thomas picked up the bowl of spring water, the surface reflecting the blue sky above. Following Joseph's subtle gestures, He turned to the east, raising the bowl slightly. I offer this water to the east, where the sun rises. Joseph prompted quietly. I offer this water to the east, where the sun rises. Thomas repeated, his voice growing stronger with each word. He turned to the south. I offer this water to the south, where life flourishes. To the west. I offer this water to the west, where the sun sets. And finally, to the north. I offer this water to the north, where wisdom dwells. Thomas then took a small sip from the bowl and returned it to the table. A palpable release of tension seemed to flow through the gathered crowd. Joseph extended his hand, and Thomas shook it firmly. The covenant is renewed, Joseph announced, his voice carrying across the ranch yard. The water remains protected. The trust continues. As suddenly as it had begun, it was ending. The riders mounted their horses with fluid, practiced movements. No words were exchanged, no further ceremony performed. They simply turned and began to ride away, the great circle dissolving as naturally as morning mist under the strengthening sun. Will I see you again? Thomas asked Joseph as the elder turned to leave. Joseph smiled for the first time. The covenant binds us, Mr. Blackwood, not in daily life, perhaps, but in all the ways that truly matter. You are never alone on this land. As Joseph mounted his horse and rode to join the departing procession, Thomas stood on his porch watching them go. The gifts remained, arranged in their spiral pattern, physical reminders of a promise renewed. For the first time in 15 years, Thomas reached for his phone and dialed his daughter's number. It was time Sarah learned about her inheritance, not just the ranch and its buildings, but the sacred trust that came with the Blackwood name. Sarah, he said when she answered, surprise evident in her voice at hearing from him outside their scheduled monthly call. There's something important I need to tell you about our land. In the distance, the riders disappeared into the morning mist, leaving Thomas alone once more, yet surrounded by the invisible bonds of a covenant that had sustained his family for generations.